10 years ago, I began practicing contemplative prayer, simply sitting in silence before God. And I started because I wanted to change. I wanted freedom. I wanted healing and peace. But for years, most mornings felt completely ordinary. No major breakthroughs, no dramatic encounters with God. Sometimes it felt like nothing was happening at all. And looking back now, I can see 3 ways God was quietly changing me during those seemingly empty mornings. And the greatest change was not the one I had spent my life trying to achieve. So was it worth it? Yes, absolutely, but not for the reason I expected. For most of my life, there was one thing I wanted more than anything else: transformation. I wanted freedom from addiction. I wanted freedom from shame. Even after becoming a Christian, that longing never really went away. It just became more spiritual. The striving didn't disappear. It simply became religious. I constantly felt like something was missing, like I wasn't enough. And I was continually trying to change because, honestly, I simply didn't like who I was. Almost everything I pursued was driven by one quiet belief: I don't measure up. Maybe you felt that too. Maybe you love God. You're trying to follow Him. You read the books. Listen to all the sermons. Maybe you tried to become more disciplined, and yet some part of you still wonders, why am I still like this? And that longing is part of why I created Simple Contemplative, to help people like me move beyond spiritual striving and discover a deeper life with God. About 10 years ago, I began occasionally sitting silently before God during my morning quiet time. Just a few minutes at first, but over the years, that silence slowly became the centerpiece of my mornings. Not because I was having incredible spiritual experiences. Again, many mornings felt completely ordinary. Some felt empty. But something just kept drawing me back. And now, after almost 10 years of practicing contemplative prayer, people sometimes ask me, has it actually changed anything? And again, the answer is yes, but not overnight, and not in the ways I expected. But before I show you the 3 changes, you need to understand what those 10 years actually look like. This wasn't a peaceful decade spent quietly sitting with God while everything around me fell neatly into place. These were seasons when I struggled with the deepest depression I had ever experienced. I remember driving to stock shelves at Walmart at 4 o'clock in the morning and sitting in the parking lot and feeling like I couldn't even get out of my car. It felt like the depression was just this physical weight, pinning me to the seat. And during that season, I was working 3 jobs just trying to make ends meet. I stocked shelves before sunrise. I did graphic design in the evenings. I pastored a tiny country church, and all of that while working through seminary part-time. And so one morning on my way to work, a worship song came on the radio about surrender. And I immediately burst into tears, because in that moment, it felt like surrender was what had placed me in this mess. I was doing my best to give every day to God with open hands. But life simply wasn't turning out the way I thought it would. I don't want to leave the wrong impression. Again, like looking back, I'd say that about 80% of the time, God gave me just a deep sense of peace and joy, even during those challenging times. But the other 20%, included some of the darkest times of my life. And these changes were not theories I learned during peaceful mornings. They were formed in a life that often looked nothing like the life I had planned for. Nothing like the life I had prayed for. And the first change exposed why all my previous attempts at transformation had eventually left me exhausted. Because I wasn't only trying to change my behavior, I was trying to prove that my life had value. First thing that contemplative prayer changed was the way I related to myself. For most of my life, I believed transformation depended on me. If I could understand myself better, if I tried harder, if I was more disciplined, or if I prayed more faithfully, then maybe I could finally become the person I wanted to be. And for a while, that approach seemed to work. I could change some of my behaviors. I could build better habits. But beneath all that, the same wounds were still there. The same fears, the same shame, the same need to prove that my life mattered. One of the deepest examples of that was my need for purpose. I've always been an incredibly purpose-driven person. And that can sound like a strength, and sometimes it was, but purpose eventually became part of my identity. I needed to feel useful. I needed to believe I was doing something important for God. For as long as I can remember, I dreamed of serving God in full-time ministry. And the strange thing is, when God very clearly called me to seminary, He also began very clearly closing all the doors to ministry. And that became one of the deepest sources of my depression. In high school, I'd been voted most likely to succeed. And 20 years later, I found myself stocking shelves at Walmart, before sunrise. Now, that was not how I thought my life would turn out. Whenever I found myself in a room full of pastors or ministry leaders, my false self would immediately begin comparing. Why them and why not me? Did I miss God's will somewhere along the line? And when life didn't unfold the way I thought it should, I didn't just feel disappointed. I felt lost. Because if I wasn't accomplishing something meaningful, I wasn't sure who I was. Over time, contemplative prayer helped me become aware of that pattern. But awareness didn't just immediately set me free. I could recognize the false self reaching for purpose and significance, but I couldn't reason my way out of it. I couldn't overpower it with willpower. And once you see a pattern in yourself, you want to fix it. You want to prove you've grown beyond it. But trying to force myself to stop striving was still striving. Trying to achieve freedom from performance was still performance. All I could do was surrender it. Every time I became aware of that old pattern, I brought it back to God again and again and again. Contemplative prayer was slowly teaching me that transformation didn't begin with fixing myself. It began with consent, with opening my hands, with allowing God to meet me exactly where I was. A few years ago, I was driving home from work when suddenly, kind of out of the blue, I realized, that old need for purpose no longer had the same grip on me. Nothing dramatic had happened. There'd been no breakthrough moment in prayer. I simply noticed that it was no longer controlling me the way it once had. I began noticing that when I was around pastors and ministry leaders, I no longer sat there comparing my life with theirs, at least most of the time. I could celebrate what God was doing through them. I didn't need their calling to look smaller so mine could feel significant. I could be grateful to be one small part of the body of Christ. For years I had tried to transform myself, but somewhere in the repeated surrender, somewhere in all those seemingly ordinary mornings, God had begun healing something I could never heal on my own. And contemplative prayer didn't give me a better technique for fixing myself. It taught me to notice what was happening within me. To bring it honestly before God and surrender the outcome to Him. It taught me that transformation is something I receive, not something I achieve. But surrender created a question I'd never really considered. If I stopped chasing the person I hoped to become, then what was left? For most of my life, the present moment had felt like something to endure while I waited for real life to begin. And the next change was so ordinary that I almost missed it. And the second thing that contemplative prayer changed was the way I experienced the present moment. This one surprised me the most. As an Enneagram 4 and someone with a long history of addiction, I spent much of my life chasing intensity. I wanted excitement. I wanted the next experience, the next accomplishment, and the next thing that would finally satisfy whatever seemed to be missing inside of me. Which is one reason why contemplative prayer felt so strange in the beginning. Every morning I would sit in silence for 20 minutes. And generally there'd be no new insight, no emotional high, just silence. And that was hard because, if you believe fulfillment is always somewhere else, sitting still can feel incredibly uncomfortable. Everything inside you wants to move, to accomplish, to chase something more interesting. And silence revealed how uncomfortable I was with the life I actually had. It showed how much of my attention was pointed towards the next thing. But little by little, I began discovering that the present moment wasn't empty at all. It was full. Not because every moment suddenly became exciting. Most moments were still wonderfully ordinary. But I began noticing God's presence in places I had overlooked my entire life. Driving to work, doing the dishes, walking outside, sitting quietly with a cup of coffee. The present moment slowly became less like a waiting room for real life and more like the place where God was actually meeting me. I don't have a glamorous job. It's just a normal 9-to-5 job in an ordinary old building. There's this long hallway that I have to walk throughout the day, connecting my office to the back of the building. And the walls are painted this kind of this drab, faded, bluish green color that probably hasn't changed in 20 years. There aren't even any windows. But now I can walk down that ugly hallway and feel fully content. And when I'm open to God, that hallway can be as beautiful as an ocean sunset. Not because the hallway changed, but because I have begun learning to see differently. I used to think life was something I would find when I finally escaped the ordinary. Like on a retreat or on a mountaintop or on a perfect morning. But the God I meet while hiking is the same God who meets me behind my desk or walking down that hallway. Instead of only experiencing God during my morning quiet time, I began returning to Him throughout the day. Sometimes only for a few seconds. A quiet prayer or a deep breath. A simple awareness that He was already there. And so contemplative prayer wasn't teaching me how to escape my life. It was teaching me how to inhabit it. I don't feel the same pressure to chase the next experience. What I had been searching for wasn't somewhere in the future. God had been waiting for me in the present all along. But present still wasn't the deepest change because even becoming present can turn into another spiritual technique. Another way of trying to feel better. And eventually I had to face a deeper question. Was I coming to prayer because I wanted God or because I wanted God to give me a different life? And the third thing that contemplative prayer changed was what I was actually seeking. And when I first began this journey, I wanted God to change me. I wanted freedom and peace and joy. And those are all good things. In many ways, God has given me each and every one of them. But somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I stopped coming to prayer primarily for what God could do for me. And instead, I simply wanted to be with Him. One way I noticed that change was in my prayer life. For years, I've prayed with a prayer list almost every day. I'd bring God my concerns, the people I love, the things I hoped He would do. And I still pray for those things, but instead of feeling like I had to had to explain everything to God or kind of convince him to act. I began simply entrusting those things to him. Sometimes I would picture kind of placing them into his hands. Not because I stopped caring, but because I slowly began trusting that he cared even more than I did. My youngest son is leaving for college in about a month, and and if I'm honest, I'm still not okay with it. I know it is going to be incredibly difficult when we drop him off and drive away. In the past, a transition like that would have stirred up so much fear in me. My prayers would have become this inner groaning of anxiety and fear. Almost like I was hyperventilating before God, running through every possible thing that could go wrong. And now the sadness is still there. I love my son, and it's going to hurt when he leaves. But underneath that sadness, there's also something new. A firm trust in the goodness of God. A peace rooted in knowing that God loves my son even more than I do. Surrender doesn't mean becoming detached from the people I love. It means trusting that they are held by a love deeper than my own. Prayers become less about getting through my list and more about being with the one who already knows. This kind of return can sound simple, but when you've spent your life trying to control what happens next, placing something in God's hands can feel almost impossible. That's part of why I created the 7-Day Gentle Return Journal. It's a 7-day guide to help you notice what is happening within you and gently return it to God's presence. I'll leave a link in the description. But looking back, I think this change in what I was seeking may be the greatest change of all. For most of my life, I believe there was an emptiness inside of me that needed to be filled. I chased pleasure and achievement and purpose, even spiritual growth. Because I thought if I could just become the right person, then I would finally be at peace. But contemplative prayer slowly revealed that the deepest longing in my heart wasn't ultimately for freedom or even transformation. It was for God himself. And strangely enough, the more I stopped chasing transformation and simply kept returning to him, the more transformation quietly happened. Jesus said, "I came that they may have life and have it abundantly." For years, I thought abundant life meant becoming a better version of myself. Now I think abundant life is receiving the life that has always been mine in Christ. And that realization finally answered the question I had carried through so many of my ordinary mornings. Were the silence, the dryness, the doubts, and all those years of returning to God actually worth it? And looking back over these 10 years, I can honestly say that every morning, every season of dryness, every question, every Walmart shift, every tear, every seemingly empty 20 minutes, it was all worth it. Not because contemplative prayer made my life easy, not because, it turned me into the person I once imagined becoming. It was worth it because somewhere along the way, I discovered that God himself is the gift. And I cannot imagine receiving a greater one. And when you finally truly find him, transformation has a way of taking care of itself. So if you're just beginning this journey, let me encourage you with one thing. Don't chase the extraordinary. Don't even chase transformation. Just keep returning to God. He is the gift that makes everything else worth it. You may not notice much tomorrow or next month, but one day you may look back and realize that while you were simply learning to be with him, he was quietly changing you all along. But knowing that contemplative prayer changed me still leaves one practical question. What do you actually do when you sit down in silence? Because without a simple way to begin, contemplative prayer can feel confusing or like something meant for unusually spiritual people. So in the next video, I'll walk you through exactly how I practice contemplative prayer each day. What I do with my thoughts and how you can begin without overthinking it. Click the video on the screen and I'll meet you there.